In this video, we will discuss scaling Agile. Scaling Agile means going from a few Agile teams to multiple, or even hundreds of Agile development teams. There are some unique challenges that come up whenever you have an organization where there are more than 3 or 4 teams needed to work together in coordinated fashion. Most Agile scaling frameworks try to offer ideas or techniques that can help an organization with anywhere from 4 to hundreds of Agile teams that need to work together. Again, typically, scaling projects seems to be contradictory to Agile methodologies in that the premise is that the teams are small and co-located. However, regardless of the case, their Agile can be scaled. Scaling isn't just the process of thinking about the size of the teams. There are other factors. So aside from the team factor that you see at the beginning of this chart, we also have to think about the geographic distribution of the team. Maybe they're in other cities or other countries. This has implications when it comes to face-to-face meetings and effective short daily stand-ups. Another consideration is to ensure that you plan during the release planning is captured electronically so that everyone can see where it is. Organizational distribution is something to consider. It is generally considered even if you didn't have to scale a project because you don't know which divisions initially will be a part of the project team. But scaling it just adds a level of complexity if different divisions or stakeholders are then geographically dispersed. And when we look at compliance, regulatory requirements must also be very well thought out of. And you want to ensure that the process is within the regulation or the end product, which adds value, meets, of course, the correct regulation. The customer's organization and an organization running an Agile project may both be obliged to abide by various governmental and industry regulations and guidelines. They may require the generation and archiving of particular types of documents. So even when the current regulations don't require these documents, stakeholders may ask that you create them so that they are available if the regulations change or they are required. When we look at domain complexity, there are 2 domains, if you recall, the developer and the customer. If you're scaling Agile, it can be assumed that the level of complexity of the product would then also be more complex. This would require greater exploration and experimentation, possibly having to create more prototypes and models and possible simulations. And of course, technical complexity is the final thing that needs to be considered. Generally, one would think that the bigger the project, the more complex it would be. This is often the case, and as such, careful consideration should be given to the technical landscape looks like now and where it needs to be in order to ensure that this project can be scaled. Each scaling factor we just discussed has its own range of complexity associated with it. So when you add multiple teams, they too face different combination of these factors. As a result, they need a process and a tooling environment tailored to meet their unique situation. So now that we have considered some of the factors and they're at the forefront, let's look at other considerations. For example, a project starts with one initial benchhead team until the scaling requirements are in place. Once they are, then multiple teams can be added gradually as the project proceeds to scale up. You don't want to ensure that you build up all at once and have one big bang. Instead, you want a gradual, smooth process. Again, considerations would be where the physical or virtual locations are going to happen. Are there going to be co-located teams or co-located virtual teams? We want to look up and be very cognizant of cultural diversity, especially if the teams are geographically distributed. Culture is very important when it comes to trust, open communication, and the sharing of documentation. There's also the challenge of a product owner. One thing to consider, depending on the size of the scale, is that you may want to create a product owner team with the intention of having one product owner setting priorities and mediating between stakeholders, and the other product owner for each team to help communicate what's required for each product backlog item. Again, this just might be some consideration based on the sheer size and scope of the project. And I just talked about the collaboration and possibly having multiple product owners. And of course, with that, we talked about the product backlog management and how having multiple product owners can help facilitate the ease of this. Management of various meetings really becomes a little more challenging depending on the size and the scale. If you look at the Scrum methodology, you have the Scrum, and then you have a team member from the Scrum team enter the next tier so that you have a Scrum of Scrum, and then into a third tier, which is a Scrum of Scrums. So again, the management of the various meetings is a really important consideration and should be thought out. You want to assure that you adhere to engineering and infrastructure practices so that you can scale projects effortlessly and easily. Of course, with all projects that are being scaled, there are some elements that are easier to scale than others. For example, pair programming works in teams of any size. Again, generally, you'll want them co-located. Pair programming is, as the name would suggest, that a couple, two programmers, would sit next to each other, one entering the code, the other ensuring that the code is accurate. Communication, of course, depends on Agile, on face-to-face, and is less easily scaled. So that is a negative factor that should be considered when looking at scaling projects. And we can't, of course, communicate this enough, and that coordinating communication between split teams is crucial. Again, open, free-flowing information. You want to have a rapport and trust built so that the sharing of information flows freely. There are some Agile models that should be considered when you're looking at scaling a project, and of course, Scrum is one of them. Scrum, of course, is a 2 to 4 week short iteration burst or sprint, where you have your product backlog, your sprint backlog, then your daily stand-up meetings, and hopefully then you produce a valuable product at the end of your sprint. Crystal methodologies are also a possible scalable tool or method that can be used when looking at scaling a large project. And of course, DAD, which stands for Disciplined Agile Delivery Method. And finally, scalable Agile models can also be combined with one another with non-scalable models to generate a hybrid approach, for example, with XP and Scrum. So regardless of your project, you want to make sure that there's thorough research to find out which model is best aligned with your philosophy and needs. In order to scale and stay agile, team needs to be able to synchronize and communicate communication and the sharing of data. Now, this can be challenging when you have distributed teams and across time zones. So again, you have to be cognizant of this and put the proper tools in place. You have to have a common basis for user stories and tasks. This may be online so that it is visible for distributed teams, or you may have it shared in each of the remote teams that you've scaled down into small agile teams. And then possibly plan the 2/3 iteration ahead. There's so many different perspectives on what really the best approach is to scaling, as well as what qualifies as a scaling framework. So again, it's important to be agile and implement what works best for your project. So in this video, we talked about scaling Agile, some of the challenges, ways to overcome those, and things that really need to be top of mind when taking on scaling an Agile project.